My name is Wahid Omid. This is the story of how I discovered that the blood of artists flowed through my veins long before I turned 6 years old. Please leave your like and follow the channel for more incredible stories of strength and overcoming. And leave a comment about what you thought of the story. It was a golden afternoon in Kabul in the year 1972. The scent of cardamom and tea drifted from the kitchen, mixing with the fragrance of roses that my mother Mari cultivated in our small garden. I was 5 years old and had just returned from playing in the street with my friends. My knees were dirty with earth and my hands were stained with paint we had found abandoned near the mosque. I ran through the back door as I always did, expecting to find my mother preparing dinner. But something was different that afternoon. Mari was sitting near the window, holding a small black radio in her hands. Her eyes were shining in a way I had never seen before. She held the device as if it were a treasure, with great care and reverence. From the radio came a female voice performing what seemed to be a dramatic story. It was a sweet but strong voice that spoke passionately about love and freedom. The voice had a special way of pronouncing certain words, a familiar accent that made me stop in the kitchen doorway. "Mother," I whispered, trying not to startle her. She turned quickly, as if caught doing something forbidden, but I could not take my eyes off the radio. That voice sounded so similar to something I knew well. "Mother," I exclaimed, louder this time. "The voice on the radio sounds exactly like yours." Mari's eyes widened with surprise. She quickly lowered the volume and looked nervously toward the door, making sure my father Freydin was not nearby. "Wahid," she said, kneeling in front of me and holding my small hands between hers. "You need to keep this as our secret. This is something your father cannot know about." I looked at her, confused. Why should something as beautiful as that voice on the radio need to be a secret? "But Mother, were you the one speaking on the radio?" I asked, my eyes shining with admiration. She nodded slowly, and a shy smile appeared on her face. "Yes, my son. I participate in a radio theater program, but it must be our secret. Do you understand?" At that moment, something awakened within me. A spark, an inexplicable desire began to grow. "I want to do this too, Mother. I want to speak on the radio, just like you do." Mari hugged me tight, and I could feel her heart beating fast against my chest. "Maybe someday, my little artist," she whispered softly. "Maybe someday you will." The days that followed that discovery were the longest of my 5-year-old life. Every time my father came home, I felt a tight knot in my stomach, afraid that somehow he would discover what I now knew. Freydin Sorkabi was a tall and imposing man, with a well-trimmed beard and piercing eyes that seemed to see right through people. He was known throughout Kabul for his honesty in business and his wisdom, but also for his very traditional views on how a proper family should behave. A man must work honestly, he would always say during our evening meals, and a woman must take care of the home and the children. These are the solid foundations of any respectable society. I began to observe more carefully the dynamics between my parents. During dinner, while my father talked about his daily work, I noticed how Mari's eyes would sometimes drift away, as if she were somewhere else entirely. Now I knew exactly where her mind was traveling. She was in that radio studio, playing different characters, bringing to life stories that touched the hearts of thousands of listeners throughout Afghanistan. One afternoon, about a week after my discovery, Mari called me to help her in the kitchen. While we prepared the afternoon tea together, she told me quietly about the world of radio theater. "You know, Wahid," she whispered while stirring sugar into the tea with delicate, careful movements. "My father, your grandfather Ghulam Ali Omid, always used to say that art is truly the soul of any people. He is a composer, a singer, a painter, and so much more. He is what you would call a true artist." My eyes immediately lit up with excitement. "Can I meet him someday soon?" "Of course, my dear son. And you should also learn about your father's father, Professor Maima Nagy. He was also a painter. Did you know that?" This information left me completely surprised and amazed. If both of my grandfathers were artists, Why was my father so strongly against all forms of art? Mother, why doesn't father like art if both grandfathers are artists? Mari let out a long, thoughtful sigh while looking through the window toward the courtyard, where my father sat reading his evening newspaper. Sometimes, my son, people choose very different paths from their parents. Your father sees art as something that can distract people from the serious responsibilities of everyday life. 2 weeks after my discovery about radio theater, my mother finally arranged a way to take me to meet my maternal grandfather, Ghulam Ali Omid. She told my father we were going to visit a sick friend, a small but necessary lie that made me feel like I was part of something important and secret. Grandfather Ghulam's house was located on the other side of Kabul, in an old neighborhood where the houses had large gardens filled with many different kinds of fruit trees. When we finally arrived, I could hardly believe what I was seeing. The walls of the house were completely covered with beautiful paintings. Musical instruments were scattered throughout every room, and tall piles of books reached almost to the ceiling. "So you are little Wahid," said my grandfather, kneeling down to get to my eye level. He had the kindest eyes I had ever seen, and a long grayish beard that reached down to his chest. "Mari has told me that you discovered her special talent." I nodded, still feeling intimidated by all the incredible art that surrounded me. "Come with me," he said, gently taking my hand. "I want to show you something very special." He led me to a corner of the main room where there sat an old but beautiful piano. With fingers that moved like magic, he began to play a soft, flowing melody that made me feel as if I were floating high above the clouds. "This particular song," he said while continuing to play, "is a melody I composed when your mother was born. Each individual note represents a different feeling, a different hope that I had for her future." When he finished playing, he looked directly into my eyes with great intensity. "Wahid, do you understand why your father does not appreciate art?" I shook my head, feeling very curious to know the answer. "Because he is afraid," my grandfather explained in a gentle, understanding voice. "He is afraid that art will make us forget our important responsibilities. But the real truth is that art actually teaches us to be more human, more deeply connected to our feelings and to other people." He then showed me some of his most beautiful paintings. There were landscapes of the magnificent Afghan mountains, portraits of simple but dignified people, and scenes of daily life in the busy streets of Kabul. Each painting seemed to tell its own complete story, and I found myself completely mesmerized looking at them. "Can I try painting something too?" I asked in a very timid voice. His eyes immediately gleamed with pure joy. "Of course you can. Mari, please bring some paper and paints for your talented son." For the next 2 hours, I tried my best to reproduce the majestic mountains that I could see through the window. My painting looked absolutely nothing like my grandfather's masterpieces, but he praised my work as if it were created by a great master artist. "Art is not about achieving perfection, Wahid," he taught me with great wisdom. "It is about expressing what lives deep inside here." And he gently touched my chest, right near my heart. When it came time for us to leave, my grandfather gave me a small notebook and several colored pencils as gifts. "These are for you to practice with," he said with a knowing wink. "This will be our own little secret." 3 weeks after my wonderful visit to Grandfather Ghulam, something completely unexpected happened. My father, who was normally so reserved about his past, began talking about his own father during our evening dinner. "My father, Professor Maima Nagi, died before you were born, Wahid," said Frayden, looking down at his plate of rice. "He was a man who was very different from me." Mari and I exchanged quick, discreet glances. It was extremely rare for my father to talk about family matters, especially about his father. "Different in what way?" I asked, with the natural curiosity that all 5-year-old children possess. My father let out a long, deep sigh. He was a painter. He spent countless hours painting instead of focusing on the real, practical responsibilities of life. I felt my heart begin to beat faster with excitement. Another artist in the family. But I could tell from the sad tone of my father's voice that this was a very painful memory for him. Where are his paintings now? I asked, unable to contain my curiosity. Some of them are displayed in the National Museum, replied Freyden, still not lifting his eyes from his plate. After he died, they donated some of his works. The museum people said they had important historical value. The opportunity to find out came when my father received an urgent letter about his agricultural lands in Faryab. He owned fruit plantations there, with apple and apricot orchards that had been passed down through the family for generations. I need to travel to Faryab tomorrow morning, he announced during dinner. There are serious problems with the harvest in my fruit plantations. On the morning of his departure, after he left for the long journey to his fruit lands, my mother found me playing in our small yard with my colored pencils, a special gift from Grandfather Ghulam. Wahid, she said, kneeling down beside me, would you like to see your grandfather, Professor Maima's paintings? My eyes widened with pure excitement. At the museum? Yes, exactly. I think it is time for you to see and understand his important work. The National Museum of Kabul was an absolutely impressive place for any 5-year-old child to visit. There were high corridors with decorated ceilings and beautiful artwork displayed everywhere you looked. My mother spoke politely with a museum employee who very kindly agreed to take us to a special room where some of Professor Maima Nagi's works were permanently displayed. Unlike Grandfather Ghulam, who painted landscapes and everyday scenes of life, Professor Maima had created deep and incredibly expressive portraits. Each face seemed to tell a complete story of human struggle, hope, sadness, or pure joy. There were portraits of hard-working peasants, busy merchants, and children playing happily in the streets of Kabul. He painted the people he saw and met in the streets, my mother explained softly, reading the descriptive information written on a plaque next to the artworks. He always said that each human face was like a book full of stories. I stopped walking when I saw a painting of a child, exactly my age, who was smiling brightly, with eyes completely full of dreams and possibilities. It was as if my grandfather had captured not only the child's physical appearance, but somehow their very soul. On the information plaque was written, Hope of the Future, Professor Maima Nagi, 1945. Why doesn't Father like these paintings? I asked with genuine confusion. They are so beautiful, and they are displayed in an important museum. Mari sighed deeply and knelt down beside me. Your father connects Professor Maima's art with financial difficulties that our family experienced in the past. He sees this recognition as something that came far too late to help the family when they needed it most. The museum employee, noticing my intense interest, told me that Professor Maima was considered one of Afghanistan's greatest portrait artists, and that his works were studied by art students from all over the country. Your grandfather left behind a very important legacy, the kind man said to me. Very few artists manage to capture human essence the way he was able to do. When we finally left the museum, I carried with me not only a new understanding of my grandfather, but also a strong feeling that I carried something very special within me. Professor Maima Nagi was not just a simple painter. He was a nationally recognized artist whose works deserved to be displayed in the country's most important museum. Now I realized that I carried the artistic heritage of two grandfathers, one who was still alive and could teach me directly, and another who had passed away, but whose powerful legacy continued to live on the walls of the National Museum. The most important question now was, how could I honor this incredible heritage without hurting my father? Today, many years later, when I look back and remember that special period of my childhood in Kabul, I realize that those few months of 1972 completely defined the direction my entire life would take. Discovering my mother's secret, meeting my grandfather, Ghulam Ali Omid, and finding the museum where Professor Maima Nagi's works were displayed. All of this happened when I was only 5 years old, but the impact lasted forever. The notebook that Grandfather Ghulam gave me is still with me today, with the first pages yellowed by time, filled with my childish drawings of mountains and people. The inspiration I found in Professor Maima's museum was the beginning of many paintings I would create throughout my life. always carrying the memory of those soul-filled portraits he had created. But more important than any objects was the understanding that I carried in my blood the heritage of generations of artists. My mother, Mari, hiding her passion for theater. My grandfather, Ghulam Ali Omid, with his multifaceted art that touched hearts throughout Afghanistan. My grandfather, Professor Maima Nagi, who even in death continued teaching through his paintings that captured the essence of the human soul. And I, little Wahid Omid, was just beginning to discover what kind of artist I would become. This is the story of my artistic awakening, of discovering that art is not just an activity. It is a way of seeing and feeling the world, a universal language that transcends differences and prejudices. The conflict with my father was still to come, as well as the challenges of growing up in a country that would undergo dramatic changes in the following decades. But on that late afternoon in 1972, when I recognized my mother's voice on the radio, my true journey as an artist had begun. And this is only the first part of my story.